George Hammond, who directs our forecasting program in the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, will now present his economic outlook for the state economy. George.
Well, thanks, Tom. You'll all be glad to know that my vocabulary extends beyond check, test, and counting to 10. Now, of course, my job here today is to talk to you about the West Virginia economic outlook. And the way I'm going to do that is by first giving you a sense of how the state is doing at the moment. And we'll see how the state's doing compared to our own past history and compared to the national economy. Once we've got that under our belts, then we'll turn to the outlook for the state. Now, as you know, if you've attended these conferences over the years, I've developed the habit of letting my audiences know how they'll feel once I'm done explaining the outlook for the state to them. And to kind of help with that, I've developed what I call a comfort food index, and it ranges from a pint of Haagen-Dazs ice cream if things are looking pretty good, all the way down to a good stiff drink if it'll come back. So it ranges from a pint of Haagen-Dazs ice cream all the way down to a good stiff drink if things are looking particularly rough. And at last year's conference, I told you that you were going to feel like you needed a good stiff drink. Well, it turned out after the year that we've been through, you needed not just one good stiff drink, but probably 2, 3, or 4. Not that I would ever encourage anyone to drink. But this year's outlook is still in the good stiff drink territory. But the good news is that you're probably looking at just one good stiff drink. I think in terms of the outlook, we've still got some rough times to go through in 2009. I think we're going to keep losing jobs through the rest of the year. I think by the time we get into 2010, we'll see employment roughly stabilize. And by the time we get to the second half of 2010, we'll start to see a little bit of job growth return to the state economy. So with that warning, let's jump in and see how the state is doing. And this graph shows you West Virginia and U.S. jobs so far this decade. And in terms of where West Virginia is at the moment, West Virginia has been sucked into the same vortex that swallowed the national economy. We are losing a lot of jobs. Now, one thing I want you to take away from this graph is the fact that we've already been through one recession this decade. That recession was in 2001, and I want you to notice that West Virginia started losing jobs in late 2000, early 2001. That's roughly the same time as the national economy. And we lost jobs through roughly the middle of 2003, where we started to grow again. And again, that's roughly the same timing as the national economy. Now, from the middle of 2003 to the middle of 2008, we added about 33,000 net new jobs. Translates into an average annual rate of growth of about 1%, and that's a bit slower than the nation on average. Now, by the time we get into the last half of 2007, early 2008, the national economy turns down and starts really losing jobs at a pretty rapid clip. But notice that West Virginia doesn't exactly follow suit. West Virginia basically stabilizes through most of 2008. And that's basically the energy sector boosting states' performance. You know, we have an energy boom that's in full swing in 2008, and that's helping the state at least maintain job stability while the national economy is already really in the grips of a severe downturn. Now, unfortunately, by the time we get into the first half of 2009, West Virginia is losing jobs in much the same way as the national economy. Through the second quarter of 2008 to the second quarter of 2009, West Virginia has now lost 23,000 jobs. In other words, we've lost 2/3 of the jobs that we gained during the 2003 to 2008 period. Now, those 23,000 jobs translate into roughly a 3% job loss on a year-over-year basis. And that is basically the worst year-over-year growth that we've seen since the early 1980s. But if you're looking for a silver lining in all this, it's that the national economy performed even worse over the past year. National jobs are down by almost 4%. So if you're looking for a silver lining, there's that. I also want to give you a sense of how what's transpiring at the moment is stacking up against what we've seen during the past 30 to 40 years. And this graph shows same West Virginia U.S. jobs from 1971 through the middle of 2009. And notice that what's already happened so far is worse than what happened earlier this decade. It's far worse than the early 1990s. But it's not even remotely as bad as what the state went through in the early 1980s. I want you to notice as well that the overall job growth for the state is really highly correlated with what we see for the nation. For the most part, when the national economy reaches a peak in terms of jobs, so does West Virginia. And where the national economy sees a trough or a low point in jobs, West Virginia also sees a low point at roughly the same time. That timing is almost exactly the same for the recession earlier this decade and the downturn of the early 1990s. We actually peaked before the national economy in the late 1970s, although we do reach a trough a few months after the national economy in about 1983. So the timing is generally pretty similar in terms of job growth. So if you're thinking about this story that we often hear for West Virginia is, West Virginia lags the national economy as if there's some natural law that makes it so. In terms of jobs, it's not always true. In fact, it's not very often true. But it is occasionally true that we do have different timing. Notice that we avoided the national job losses during the mid-1970s. We avoided those job losses altogether, and that was driven in large part by an energy boom in the state. Our timing is obviously different from late 2007 into early 2008, another energy-driven difference. So at least in terms of jobs, where you tend to see these big differences in timing with the national economy, that tends to be driven by the energy cycle. And when the energy cycle is not correlated with the national business cycle, then West Virginia's timing will differ more from the nation than is generally true. Now, thus the question, does West Virginia lag the national economy? It turns out to be one of these complicated answers that it depends on which cycle you look at, and it even depends on which indicator you look at. Because if we're focused on jobs, timing's generally pretty similar. But if we're looking at overall income growth, particularly wage growth, then West Virginia really does lag the national economy, and it's really pretty consistent. So we've seen big job losses so far in 2009, and that's been accompanied by this gigantic surge in the state's unemployment rate. State's unemployment rate has roughly doubled during the past year. Right? It goes from about the 4% range during the middle of 2008. Now I want to give you a sense of how these recent job losses are distributed across the state. So I put together this graph that shows employment change from the first half of 2008 to the first half of 2009. And I've got the counties sorted towards the left that are adding jobs, and the counties that are losing jobs are sorted toward the right. And a couple things to notice in this graph is that, for starters, Monongalia County is adding the most jobs of any county in the state, and that's been driven by healthcare, leisure and hospitality, and government jobs. Keep in mind that even though Mon County is still adding jobs, and a fairly significant number of jobs, it's adding far fewer jobs and at a far slower rate than earlier this decade. So the Morgantown MSA is not immune to this downturn. It's feeling it in a big way. So far, it's just translating into slower growth. Notice also that we still have many of the coal-dominated counties in the southern part of the state are still up on a year-over-year basis in terms of jobs. Now, that's likely to change over the next year. Notice that Kanawha County is losing large numbers of jobs. That's true for the Charleston metropolitan area. Those job losses are driven by manufacturing, professional and business services, and retail trade. Notice also that there's a big surprise in this graph. If you've seen these graphs over the years at Outlook conferences, something's really changed over the last year. And the big change here is what's happening in the Eastern Panhandle region. And that's gone from adding large numbers of jobs to actually losing large numbers of jobs. You see big job losses in both Berkeley and Jefferson counties. And Panhandle as a whole is down about 1,800 jobs over the past year, and that's driven by big job losses in construction as the housing correction is really concentrated out there. And they've also seen job losses in retail trade, partly due to a call center closing, but they've also seen job losses in leisure and hospitality, reflecting the gaming sector in the Eastern Panhandle. So one of the things to keep in mind about this downturn is that what we used to say, or at least so far this decade, was that there were really two engines of job growth in the West Virginia economy: Morgantown and the Eastern Panhandle. And one of those engines has recently slipped into reverse, and it's now subtracting large numbers of jobs from the state. I also want to give you a sense of how these job losses are distributed across industries. And for each sector here, you have two bars. The white bar shows average annual job growth during the 2003 to 2008 period. And the blue bars show job change, mostly job losses, during the past year. So of those 23,000 jobs that we've lost over the past year, those jobs are actually pretty evenly distributed across the goods-producing and the service-providing sectors. And that's really pretty unusual. Normally the job losses are concentrated in the goods-producing sector. It's really only in the worst downturns when we see job losses this widespread, and even in some cases concentrated in the service-providing sectors. Notice we've seen job growth in natural resources and mining turn into job losses. Construction has also seen fairly significant job losses over the past year with the housing correction hitting the state. Manufacturing, where things were already bad, things have gotten much worse. They're down about 6,000 jobs over the past year. Within the service-providing sector, we're seeing big job losses in trade, also professional and business services, leisure and hospitality, financial activities. There's really only two sectors that have grown at all over the past year, and that's healthcare and government. Now, those two sectors, we expect them to be more resilient with respect to a national recession than an average sector, or than most sectors. But keep in mind that those two sectors are not totally immune to overall business cycle developments. They're just a bit more stable over the business cycle. So overall, really widely spread job losses both across West Virginia's regions and across industries over the past year. Now, I want to spend a couple more moments on each of those goods-producing sectors. Now, manufacturing jobs are down 6,000 over the past year. That's certainly those losses have been intensified by the global downturn, but notice that we've seen huge job losses in this sector really over the past decade. And from 2000 through the latest data, employment in manufacturing is down by roughly a third. Now, output in West Virginia, as we can measure it with real manufacturing GDP, is also down during the same period, but not by nearly as much. So basically what we're seeing is some evidence of some fairly strong productivity growth in this sector in West Virginia. And that's a requirement for manufacturing because this sector is so highly competitive. It's competitive with other states in the nation. There's intense competitive pressures internationally. And there is some evidence that West Virginia's manufacturers have found ways to compete internationally, and this comes from the value of West Virginia manufacturing exports. These exports are up by roughly 150% during the past 11 years. That's far faster than the rate of inflation, and it's also far faster than the national record during the same period. So West Virginia's manufacturers are having some success in terms of gaining access to and exploiting some of these international markets. And that's a good thing. But notice that there are some costs here, some dangers, because that makes our manufacturers susceptible in some ways to global downturns. Right? The same thing was happening in the U.S., same thing hit the global economy, and that's generated a huge decline in the value of manufacturing exports. They're down somewhere in the neighborhood of 30% in the first half of 2009. So overall, West Virginia's manufacturers have made some progress in working on improving competitiveness, but there's certainly more ground to be made up there. I've also been thinking about construction employment, and construction jobs are down about 3,000 over the past year. But we have another data set that can give us a little bit more information on what's going on in construction in West Virginia, and that's a data set from FW Dodge. This tracks the value of new construction starts. And the way the data set works is that the entire value of a project shows up in 1 month, ideally about 60 days before groundbreaking. And notice that in terms of the value of our construction starts through the first 8 months of 2009, they're actually up a little bit compared to 2008. Notice also that what drove that entirely was an increase in non-building activity. And non-building activity includes infrastructure like highways, roads, water and sewer activity, but it also includes utility building, construction of power plants, scrubbers, that sort of thing. And it was the utility sector that drove that increase in 2009. So the activities of AEP and other utilities have contributed to increased activity and will help to buffer the employment losses in construction. Notice, however, that the other two sectors, non-residential and residential activity, are down in 2009. And as far as residential activity goes, we get over the decades so far kind of a mirror image of the national housing correction. We get the value of residential activity rising strongly from 01 to 06. It's up by roughly a factor of 4, so it quadruples. By the time we get to 2006, that activity is really unevenly distributed across the state because about 60% of the value of starts are in the eastern panhandle region in 2006. Now, we get a big drop off from 2006 to 2009. It's down by about 77%. In other words, activity in 2009 is actually a little bit below where we started in 2001. And certainly the eastern panhandle has been a big driver of that. It's driven about half the decline in residential activity during the past 3 years. We get a little different perspective on this from the house price appreciation data. And this data comes from Federal Housing Finance Administration, tracks repeat sales on single-family homes whose loans are eventually sold to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And that matters because those loans top out at about $417,000. So this measure misses the very upper end of the housing market. And what we get in return for that is pretty good geographic coverage. We get data for all states, all metropolitan areas in the nation, and even non-metropolitan areas of states. And basically what we see is that for the nation, we get the second consecutive year of year-over-year declines. These house prices are down about 4% nationally during the past year. Notice that West Virginia is a bit more stable. House prices are down about 1.5% during the past year. And if you look at the metropolitan areas that include West Virginia counties, we're either seeing small increases in house prices or small declines. But overall, the housing correction is hitting most of our markets, but prices are either up a little bit or down a little bit. The big exception here is those metropolitan areas that include the eastern panhandle counties. And those metropolitan areas are down a lot. Hagerstown, Martinsburg is down about 12% over the past year. It's about 11% for Winchester and about 8% for the Washington metro area. That's the second consecutive year of big declines for each of those metro areas. And just to put this in perspective for you, each of those three areas saw their house prices roughly double during the first 6 years of the decade. And since 2006, house prices in each of these markets are down roughly 18 to 23% at this point. So again, what we see is that the boom markets are getting the worst of the housing correction, but the housing correction is hitting the state on average. And the housing correction is also showing up in foreclosure data. And this data is put together by the West Virginia Division of Banking. And what we see in 2008 is a big increase in foreclosures for the state. They're up about 12% over 2007. And in 2008, those foreclosures are also really concentrated in the eastern panhandle region, including Hampshire County. Those 4 counties account for about 30% or 1/3 of the foreclosures in 2008. Now, in 2008, foreclosures in the eastern panhandle are running at about 1% of housing units as measured by the Census Bureau. That's roughly double the foreclosure rate in 2007, and it's about triple the state rate in 2008. So again, what we see is the boom markets are experiencing the worst of the housing downturn. That's true for employment, the residential activity data from Dodge. We see it in house prices and in the foreclosure data. Now, I want to finish up this section by talking a little bit about coal mining. Natural resources and mining jobs are down about 2,600 over the past year. Coal mining is still the big dog in natural resources and mining, but oil and gas extraction is growing quickly. It's grown really quickly so far this decade. In terms of coal production is down significantly in 2009. It's down about 13% second quarter of 2008 to the second quarter of 2009. That puts the level of coal production at somewhere in the neighborhood of 140 million tons at an annual rate. That's down 20 million tons from the same period a year ago when we were running about 160 million tons. And basically, we haven't seen this 140 million ton rate since 2003. So overall, this global downturn has had a big impact on West Virginia's coal production. And we've also seen this big cycle in energy prices that has affected activity in the state. If we look at spot coal prices, we've got Northern Appalachia and Central Appalachia. Northern Appalachia is the northern coal fields in West Virginia. Central Appalachia includes the state's southern coal fields. And notice that those spot coal prices go from about $45 per ton in the summer of 2007 all the way up to about $145 per ton by the summer of 2008. It's roughly a tripling. And with the global downturn, we see those prices come right back down. By the time we get to the summer of 2009, we're back to about $45 to $50 per ton in terms of those spot coal prices. Notice we've seen something similar both in natural gas prices and in crude oil prices. At least in terms of natural gas, those prices are now well below their summer of 2007 levels. And we also see this big cycle in exports of minerals and ores, and again, that's dominated by coal. So we get this big surge in 2008 where the value of West Virginia coal exports rises by about 150%. Once the global recession hits, we see those coal exports really cut back significantly. They're down about 24% in the second quarter of 2009 compared to the same quarter a year ago. So notice also that that has a big impact on the state's overall commodity exports because now coal is a much bigger proportion of those commodity exports than it was even 3, 4, or 5 years ago. So overall, where is the state at the moment? West Virginia has been sucked into the same recession that swallowed the national economy. We're losing jobs at a really rapid rate. Essentially, the rate of job loss is the worst we've seen since the early 1980s. Those job losses are really widely distributed across regions, across sectors, and the unemployment rate is up significantly. It's roughly double. And this is all very similar to what's happened for the national economy, but we're probably doing just slightly better. So let's turn to the outlook for the state economy. Now, I've hinted so far that what happens in West Virginia depends in important ways on what happens to the national and international economies. And in the same way, the forecast depends on a forecast for the U.S. and the world. Now, the forecast on which my numbers are built calls for U.S. real GDP growth to recover in the second half of 2009 and into 2010 and to keep growing through 2014. Now, unfortunately, national job growth doesn't rebound as quickly. We continue to see job losses into 2010 before things recover nationally. And what that sets West Virginia up for is something similar. We continue to see significant job losses through the end of 2009. By the time we get to 2010, we start to stabilize, and by the end of 2010, we're starting to grow a bit more, although that growth will still seem pretty soft. So what we get at the end of the day is a fairly severe downturn. From peak to trough, the current downturn looks like it's going to cost West Virginia about 4% of its jobs. That's much worse than what we saw earlier this decade, much worse than the early 1990s. But notice that it's not even close to what we went through in the early 1980s when we lost about 13% of our jobs. Notice also that the outlook for the nation is a little bit worse. They lose about 5% of their jobs overall. Let's take a look at how things work out across industries. And here you've got two bars for each sector. The blue bar shows job growth over the past 5 years. The white bar is the forecast. And what I'm looking for is really slow growth in West Virginia over the next 5 years. That's below 1%. It's about half the national rate. Notice that for natural resources and mining, strong job gains turn into job losses. That reflects a fairly slow rebound in coal production over the next couple of years. stays in the neighborhood of 140 million tons for the next couple of years, and gradually works its way back to 148 million tons by 2014. Keep in mind that this forecast assumes no change in the regulatory environment, so no change to surface mining permits, no change in carbon emissions regulation during the period. Construction jobs rebound a little bit, at least they keep growing. That reflects the gradual dissipation of the housing correction and also continued investment in the state, including utility projects. Manufacturing stabilizes a bit over the next 5 years. We'll talk about that more with the next slide. Most of the job gains, however, come in the service-providing sectors like healthcare, professional and business services, even leisure and hospitality. Professional and business services reflects this overall rebound in the national and world economy. Healthcare reflects demographic shifts, and the continued growth in leisure and hospitality is relatively slow, and that reflects the increased competitive pressure, particularly in the gaming sector of the state economy. So overall, pretty slow growth for the state. But one of the things that helps us is that the world economy grows. West Virginia depends in part on what happens to world economic growth. So as those international trading partners recovers, that translates into additional demand for coal, for manufacturing goods as well. We're also looking for a fairly significant decline in the value of the dollar, and that makes West Virginia produced goods and services more competitive internationally, and that helps generate additional growth as well. So the world recovery helps our export sectors, mining, manufacturing. It also helps an export sector we don't talk that much about, which is tourism. West Virginia becomes a more competitive place for tourists as the dollar declines. What we get over the forecast is fairly slow overall job growth, and that's going to generate income growth, but again, that's going to be pretty slow compared to the national average. And in turn, what that generates is a gradual increase in the income gap with the national economy, particularly after we get to 2011. Notice that we get initially a big drop in the income gap with respect to the national economy. It goes from around 23% in 2008 down to 17% in 2009. And what's driving that is the national economy falling back to West Virginia. And what drives that is the importance of transfer income to the state. Transfers include Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare payments, unemployment insurance. And each of these components are either not correlated with current economic activity or they're actually designed to be counter-cyclical. And one of the characteristics of West Virginia is we get an unusually large share of our income from transfers. Makes up about a quarter of our personal income. That's by far the largest share of any state in the nation, much bigger than the national average of about 15%. So what tends to happen in business cycle downturns is that the national economy responds more than does West Virginia, and we actually make progress in terms of catching up in terms of per capita personal income. Again, that's driven by the national economy falling back. As the national economy accelerates out of a recession, they generate faster growth in West Virginia, and the gap starts to grow again. Now, overall job and income growth sets the stage for West Virginia to grow its population, although that growth is really modest. One of the things to keep in mind about West Virginia's population is that it's demographically challenged. We're the only state in the nation that has recorded more deaths than births so far this decade. And that makes our population growth totally dependent on net migration. And when our job and income growth is at or below the national average, it's really hard for the state to attract more migrants than we lose to other states, and thus we get essentially population stability. Now, that doesn't mean there's nothing going on with respect to West Virginia's demographics or population growth, because there's a lot going on underneath the surface, both in terms of where the population growth occurs across regions and where it occurs across demographic groups. Keep in mind that the Eastern Panhandle really dominates West Virginia's population growth. So far this decade, the Panhandle has added 36,000 residents. Just to put that in perspective, the state as a whole added 7,500 residents during the decade. And that means that without the Panhandle, and indeed without Berkeley County alone, the state would have seen significant population losses so far this decade. Now, in terms of demographics, we're in for a big change in where the population growth hits across age groups. During the past years, we've seen relatively strong growth in the 45 to 64 age group. And notice that that's about to change completely. By the time we get to 2011, we start to see population losses in the 45 to 64 age group, and what takes off is the 65 and older age group. And of course, this is the aging of the baby boom generation into that 65 and older group. And that aging of the baby boom generation is going to have big impacts on West Virginia's labor market. You know, the baby boomers will eventually retire in big numbers. We don't know exactly when that's going to happen, but it will eventually happen. And the thing to keep in mind about baby boomers is that we are unusually highly educated. And that suggests that when we start to retire, we're going to create job openings for highly educated individuals. And this may create opportunities for graduates of West Virginia public higher education institutions. Now, over the past couple of years, I've been analyzing a data set provided by the West Virginia Higher Education Policy Commission. And this data set tracks West Virginia public higher ed grads to jobs in the state. So we can tell in 2008 how many graduates during the past 4 years were holding those jobs. And what we see is that in 2008, almost 54% of the graduates during the past 4 years were working at establishments that are located in West Virginia. So a majority of those graduates are working in the state. Now, notice that for Promise graduates, it's a substantially higher proportion. About just over 62% of those Promise recipients so far were actually working in the state in 2008. But the key comparison for Promise graduates is not total graduates, because total graduates includes both in-state students and out-of-state students. And what we tend to see is that these retention rates for in-state students are much higher than they are for out-of-state students. So if you want to figure out what impact the Promise Scholarship is having on work participation, you want to compare Promise grads to other in-state grads. And what you find there is that Promise grads are actually slightly less likely to remain in the state to work than the average in-state grad. And that remains true even if you can control for basically all of the demographic characteristics in the data set, including age, sex, race, area of concentration, which is like a major. You still find this basic characteristic that the Promise grads are a little less likely to remain in the state than the average in-state graduate. And that suggests that the Promise Scholarship isn't doing a lot for the state in terms of contributing to its human capital development. But one of the things to keep in mind about the Promise Scholarship is that it was designed to do a number of things, including help improve student achievement, and there is some good statistical evidence that that's happening. In addition to the extent to which the college helps retain students in the state, even if it's just for the years that they're in college, there's likely a positive economic impact associated with that as well through the student and the parent spending that remains within our borders. So let me try and sum up the outlook for the state economy. What we're looking at for the state is a pretty rough 2009. We're likely to continue losing jobs. We should start to stabilize in the first half of 2010 and see a little bit more job growth in the last half of 2010. Essentially, the growth we get after the recovery is really pretty slow. You know, on average, it's about half the national rate. Another way to put that is that it takes us until about 2013 before we replace the jobs that we lost during the downturn. Overall, we get income growth, so our standard of living rises over time, but we again lose ground with respect to the national economy during the period. Our population growth is really slow, and that sets us up for a rapid demographic aging. In terms of the unemployment rate, we do make some progress in terms of driving that unemployment rate down over the forecast, but we never get the unemployment rate back to the level we started at in 2008, at least not within the next 5 years. So what we're looking at for the state is essentially there is light at the end of the tunnel. We've still got quite a bit of tunnel to get through, but we will eventually get there, and the state will start growing again. And with that, I'll conclude my comments. And I'd be happy to take a question or two if there's time. Just let me know.
On the work participation rate, how much we have they said they went back to graduate school and they're not counting in the workforce at this time.
Right. The question pertains to the Promise Scholarship and this idea that the Promise Scholarship may be making a pretty small contribution to retaining additional graduates within the state. And the question drives at the issue of enrollment. You know, once the Promise graduates get through the program, maybe they're not working because they're enrolled in graduate school. That does happen to a high degree with Promise graduates. They do pursue additional education. We can track that if they pursue higher education in the state. So if the number you want to point to is, do we at least keep the grads in the state? The Promise Scholarship number will go up if we include grads who are enrolled. The issue is that the in-state number goes up as well, so you still find this relative difference, even if you're focused on the work participation plus enrollment number. It doesn't make that basic difference between the Promise Scholars and all in-state scholars go away. In terms of does the labor market's performance overall have an impact on work participation? Yeah, absolutely it does. If you look at the data by major, it appears that some of the more technical majors tend to leave the state. We retain a lot of healthcare workers, a lot of healthcare graduates, a lot of education graduates in the state. We do retain some of the higher tech majors, but at lower rates than we do teachers, healthcare workers, and just to some extent the business majors. So absolutely, the job opportunities in the state have a big impact. And we don't have a lot of evidence on this data from other states. We're in the process of building that as part of a report that we'll be issuing with the Higher Education Policy Commission later this year that will allow us to track those graduates to employment in some of our surrounding states. And that'll help us get a little bit better feel for how the characteristics of West Virginia's labor market in terms of what industries are growing or not growing in the state and how that contributes to the grads that stay in the state versus grads that don't. So the plan is to continue this line of research and to continue to ferret out the ways that higher education helps develop human capital and the policies that promote that and the policies that don't. But one thing, make no mistake, universities, colleges, they contribute to the human capital development of their regions. This is a point that's aimed more at the Promise Scholarship. Yes, Mark.
I think you mentioned this question might come up anyway, so I'm going to ask it. In terms of long-term economic growth for the state over a period of years, been involved with tax modernization, previous efforts. One of the things that keeps coming up on the radar screen is the lack of capital formation in the state. And the typical culprit there is property taxes on the personal level. That would be machinery, equipment, inventory, which are local taxes, locally imposed taxes. So the question is that really the major tax change, getting rid of personal property taxes, and I'm talking about local taxes on machinery and equipment, and also because local governments struggle to get by right now, what alternative forms of tax revenue should they be looking to replace the money lost by taxes on personal property?
Well, the question pertains to capital development in West Virginia and what tax policies might contribute to that. A co-author and I have done a really detailed study based on county-level data aggregating up to labor market regions that analyzes labor force growth, capital growth, and total factor productivity growth at the local level in manufacturing. And we studied that over roughly a 30-year period. And what you find is that West Virginia is losing manufacturing jobs at about the same rate as most states. The difference between West Virginia and most states, and the reason why we generate lower output growth, is because we have unusually low levels of capital stock development. This is physical capital, machinery, plant and equipment. We have unusually low development of capital, and we have unusually low total factor productivity growth. Generally rank about 40 to 45th in the nation over the last 20 to 30 years. So it's capital stock development that matters and total factor productivity growth. And one of the things we looked at in the study is, well, what are some of the factors that drive capital stock development. And what you see is that taxes matter for the location of capital. And we know that West Virginia has at least one tax, probably more, that discourage capital stock development. One of these is the personal property tax for inventory, machinery, and equipment. So that's those relationships, those detailed relationships that we estimated suggest that West Virginia should look at ways to increase capital stock growth in the state. Tax policy is going to matter for that, and certainly looking at reducing or eliminating taxes on capital that matter, including that property tax, are one option that should be looked at to help manufacturing and the state's economy in general. Now, as we all well know, if you reduce taxes on one component, you're quickly going to face a budget deficit, which is not allowed. We have to balance it by raising taxes elsewhere. So the second part of the question is where to raise taxes, and that's obviously a tougher question to answer. We have to make choices about what we want to do and how we want to pay taxes. What I can tell you is that additional investment in the capital stock is key for long-run growth. If you're interested in seeing more manufacturing employment, more manufacturing output in the state, increasing the capital stock is one way to get that. And one way to get that in turn is to reduce taxes that reduce capital growth. The cost of that is that you're going to face higher taxes, or you'll have to sacrifice services in the long run in order to get that additional growth. One last question. Yes, sir.
You commented earlier with regard to coal mining that your projections did not include any environmental changes. I think it's been well publicized with regard to the mountaintop removal permits that have been held up in abeyance between EPA and the Corps of Engineers. Have you done a back of the envelope computation as to the impact if the state is not able to continue in the long term when mountaintop removal is a source of coal mining?
Right. The question goes to essentially to risks to the forecast. And certainly one risk to the outlook is the risk of a national recession in 2010, which remains a possibility, so we'll want to watch the national outlook overall. That affects coal, affects the rest of the state as well. An additional risk to the forecast is changes in environmental regulations, including changes to the way we regulate surface mines. That's at least what I'm hearing in the press is that there are some coal operators who believe that they're sufficiently permitted for the next year or two, but we are mining that coal out. It's a non-renewable resource. We do need to find ways to mine coal, and for coal, costs matter in a big way, right? It's a commodity, so the cost at which that coal is mined has a big impact on the long-term development. And policies that increase the cost of mining are probably going to reduce the coal that's mined in West Virginia. Now, that said, we can reasonably agree that we shouldn't bury these streams and we should face those economic impacts. But policies that reduce coal that's mined or raise the cost of mining that coal will have impacts on the amount of coal produced, the amount of employment, tax revenues, and so on down the line. So that's a balance that we need to keep in mind going forward. And finally, a last sort of risk to the forecast that I'll mention is notice that healthcare is a big part of overall job growth over the next 5 years. And we are as a nation going through a big discussion on how to whether or not to expand coverage, how to finance that coverage, and there's at least the potential out here for slower growth in Medicare going forward. We don't have a much track record of doing that, but if that were to transpire over the future, that has an unusually big impact on the state because of our elderly population, and that has the potential to reduce growth not only in healthcare, but that spills over to the rest of the economy as well. So another factor to watch going forward. And with that, I will thank you for your time and for your patience, and I'll turn the mic back over to Tom.